The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry, endless plains. Ahuli and Simi, two Native American sisters, walked side by side, their footsteps soft on the earth. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the air carried a faint scent of dust. They had been traveling for weeks, leaving behind their home in the east, their tribe scattered, their land taken by outsiders. Their people had been pushed from their homeland, their villages burned, and their lives turned upside down. In the wake of these hardships, Ahuli and Simi had taken it upon themselves to find a place where their people could live in peace, away from the growing presence of settlers. It was a journey full of uncertainty, and every day brought new challenges. Ahuli was the older sister, tall and strong, with dark hair that flowed like the river. Her face was calm, but behind her eyes, there was a quiet sadness. She had always been the protector, the one to lead when others needed guidance, but even she couldn't deny how tired she had become. Her body ached, her mind was weary, and her heart, though full of hope, was also burdened by the weight of their mission. Simi, her younger sister, was more cheerful, though her energy had also started to fade. She had always been the one to keep spirits high with her laughter and bright smile, but now those smiles were fewer and farther between. They both knew they couldn't keep going like this for much longer. The sisters had been traveling for days without rest. They had crossed rivers, climbed hills, and walked through thick forests. They had slept under the stars, huddling together for warmth, and had gone without food for longer than they cared to admit. There were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on their shoulders, but they couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. As they walked, the sisters talked quietly to each other, sharing their thoughts and dreams. "Do you think we'll ever find it?" Simi asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. Ahuli glanced at her sister, offering a small smile. "I don't know, Simi, but we must keep going. Our people need us, we can't stop now." The road ahead seemed endless, but they had no choice but to keep moving. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep going west. There were whispers of a distant place, a land untouched by settlers where their people could live freely. The sisters had heard stories of it, passed down from their elders, and they believed it existed. They just had to find it. Days turned into weeks, and still, they pressed on. The land around them was vast, stretching out for miles in every direction. Sometimes the ground was dry and cracked, other times it was muddy and difficult to walk through. They had seen wild animals, deer, wolves, and even bison, but there was no sign of other people. The sisters had been hoping for some kind of sign, something to tell them they were on the right path. One morning, as they trudged through the thick brush, Ahuli spotted something in the distance. She stopped, squinting against the sun. There, just beyond a line of trees, she could see the outline of something that looked like a settlement. At first, she wasn't sure if it was a mirage, a trick of the heat, but as they drew closer, it became clearer. It was a small town, a group of wooden houses clustered together at the edge of a river. There was smoke rising from chimneys, and people were moving around, busy with their daily tasks. The sisters exchanged a look. This was the first sign of human life they had seen in weeks. They knew they had to approach cautiously, unsure of how the people in the town might react to strangers, especially Native Americans. "We should go," Simi said softly, her voice nervous but hopeful. "Maybe we can find food, rest, and continue on our journey." Ahuli nodded, but her mind was filled with doubt. She had heard stories of how Native people were treated by settlers, stories of distrust, violence, and fear. She wasn't sure what to expect here, but she also knew that they couldn't continue on without help. The sisters took a deep breath and walked toward the town. As they approached, the townspeople took notice. Some stopped what they were doing and stared at them. The sisters kept their heads high, trying to appear calm, though their hearts raced in their chests. When they reached the center of town, they were met by a group of settlers sitting around a fire. They were talking quietly, but as Ahuli and Simi approached, their conversation died down. The settlers watched them carefully, sizing them up. There was an uneasy silence, and the sisters could feel the tension in the air. One of the men stood up. He was tall, with rough, calloused hands and a face weathered by the sun. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. His voice was thick with suspicion. Ahuli took a deep breath, her eyes steady. She had rehearsed what she was going to say in her mind, but now that she was here, it felt harder than ever. "We are traveling," she said, her voice calm but weary. "We have been walking for many days. Our people are scattered, and we are searching for a safe place to rest." The man looked at her with narrowed eyes. "You should move on," he said. "This is no place for strangers." The word stung, but Ahuli didn't show it. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Please," she said, "we can't walk any further. Just one night, that's all we ask." The man looked at the sisters for a long moment, his eyes filled with doubt. He glanced back at the others, who murmured among themselves. For a moment it seemed as though the sisters would be turned away. They were strangers after all, and the settlers had every reason to be cautious. But then something unexpected happened. An older woman who had been sitting quietly in the corner stood up. Her face was kind, lined with years of experience, and her eyes were filled with a soft understanding. She walked over to the sisters and placed a hand on Ahuli's shoulder. "Let them stay," she said, her voice gentle. "They are tired and in need of rest. We've all been there." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between the sisters and the older woman. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Fine," he said. "One night, but that's it." The sisters exchanged a surprised glance, relief flooding through them. They had been granted what they needed, and in that moment, it felt like a small victory. As the evening wore on, the sisters were led to a small barn behind the woman's house. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was more than they had hoped for. They lay down on the hay, exhausted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they closed their eyes, allowing the sounds of the night to lull them to sleep. Tomorrow would come, and they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. But for now, they had one night of rest, and that was enough. The moonlight streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, casting soft shadows across the floor where the sisters lay. Ahuli shifted slightly on the hay, trying to get comfortable, but sleep did not come easily. Her body was tired, aching from the long journey, but her mind was wide awake. She thought about their people, scattered and lost, and the dangerous path that lay ahead. What would they find tomorrow? Would they ever find the peace they so desperately sought? Simi, curled up beside her, was asleep, her breathing even and steady. Ahuli glanced over at her younger sister, her heart heavy with the responsibility she felt for them both. Simi had always been the more hopeful one, the one who believed in stories of hidden lands and new beginnings. But Ahuli knew that hope alone would not get them through this journey. They needed something more, something real. The thought of continuing the journey the next day filled her with dread. They had already come so far, yet it felt like they were no closer to finding the safety they were searching for. The world outside seemed unforgiving, and every step they took was a reminder of how much they had lost. But even as these dark thoughts clouded her mind, she couldn't shake the memory of the kind woman who had helped them. Margaret, the older woman, had been the first to speak up in their favor, when the others in the town were ready to send them away. Her words had been simple but strong, filled with a warmth that had given Ahuli a glimmer of hope. "Let them stay," Margaret had said. "They are tired and in need of rest." And just like that, they had been offered shelter. That kindness, however small, made Ahuli wonder if there was more to this place than just strangers and suspicion. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for something better here. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustle of the wind outside. Ahuli stretched and rose to her feet, careful not to wake Simi. She stepped out of the barn and into the cool morning air, feeling the crispness of the dawn on her skin. The town was still quiet, with only a few people starting their day. The sound of roosters crowing in the distance and the clink of tools from nearby homes filled the air. Margaret was already outside, tending to a small garden behind her house. Ahuli walked over to her, her feet crunching on the dirt path. "Good morning," Ahuli said softly, offering a small smile. Margaret looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning, my dear. Did you sleep well?" Ahuli nodded, though her mind was still clouded with worries. "Thank you for letting us stay last night." Margaret smiled warmly, her eyes filled with a kindness that made Ahuli feel at ease. "So no need to thank me. You needed rest and I could see the exhaustion in your eyes. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Ahuli hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "We didn't want to impose. We don't want to cause any trouble." Margaret shook her head, her hands resting on her hips. "You're not causing any trouble. Everyone in this town has their own burdens to bear, but that doesn't mean we can't help one another. It's the least I can do." Ahuli glanced toward the other houses, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "I just don't know what to do next. We've been walking for so long. I don't know where to go anymore." Margaret looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking. "Well, why don't you come inside? I'll make us some breakfast and we can talk about it. Maybe I can help." Ahuli was surprised by the offer but felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Margaret." The two women walked together toward the small house, the sound of their footsteps quiet in the morning stillness. As they entered, the warmth from the hearth wrapped around them, a sharp contrast to the cool air outside. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the room, and a pot of stew simmered on the stove. Simi had woken up by then and joined them at the table, her face still sleepy but curious. Margaret served them breakfast and they all sat down to eat in comfortable silence. The food was simple, bread, stew, and hot tea, but to Ahuli and Simi it felt like a feast. They hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the warmth of the food filled them with a sense of peace. As they ate, Margaret asked more about their journey. Ahuli shared their story, how they had left their village in search of safety, how they had been pushed from place to place, always running from the threats that seemed to follow them. The sisters had heard rumors of a distant land, a place where they could live without fear. But the road had been long and every step felt like a struggle. When Ahuli finished telling their story, there was a long silence. Margaret sat back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked deep in thought. "I understand what you're going through," Margaret said softly. "I've lived through difficult times myself. When I was younger, my family had to move too. We had to leave behind everything we knew. It wasn't easy, but we made it through. We found a way to start over." Ahuli looked at Margaret, surprised by the depth of her understanding. "How did you do it?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Margaret smiled gently. "It wasn't one thing. It was many small things that came together. We helped each other. We found strength in one another, and we never gave up on the idea of a better future." Simi, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. "Do you think we'll find a place like that? A place where we can finally rest?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe it's possible, but you have to be open to finding it in unexpected places. It might not look like what you imagine, but it can still be home. Sometimes it's not about finding the perfect place, it's about making the best of what you have." Ahuli felt a spark of hope flicker in her chest. Could it be true? Could they really find peace even in a place that wasn't their own? The idea seemed impossible, yet the more Margaret spoke, the more it felt like something worth trying. Simi smiled softly, her eyes bright. "Maybe this town could be part of our new beginning." Ahuli didn't answer right away, but in her heart, she knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more hardships, but maybe, just maybe, they had found a place to begin again. And for the first time in a long while, the thought of a new beginning didn't seem so far out of reach. As they finished their meal, Margaret's voice brought Ahuli back to the present. "I know a few people in town who could help you with your journey. If you'd like, I can introduce you to them. Maybe together, we can figure out what comes next." Ahuli looked at Simi, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on her shoulders seemed just a little lighter. "We would be grateful," she said. Margaret smiled, the warmth of her kindness filling the room. "Then it's settled. We'll work together. You're not alone in this." And in that moment, Ahuli realized that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, she didn't have to carry the burden of their journey alone. There were people here who cared. There was still hope. The town seemed quieter now, the morning rush of activity slowing down as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Ahuli, Simi, and Margaret had spent the day talking about the future, about possibilities. Margaret had introduced them to a few of the townspeople, and as the afternoon wore on, they began to feel a small sense of belonging, something they hadn't felt in a long time. As evening approached, the sisters walked back to the small barn behind Margaret's house. The warmth from the sun was beginning to fade, replaced by a cool breeze that stirred the dry grass. Ahuli looked up at the sky, which was slowly turning a soft shade of purple. She had been lost in thought all day, trying to imagine a future here. Could this town really be the place they had been searching for? Simi, walking beside her, seemed a little lighter, her shoulders not as tense as they had been the day before. She had enjoyed meeting the townspeople and felt the faintest spark of hope for the first time in what felt like ages. "Do you think we'll be able to stay here?" Simi asked, her voice hopeful. "Maybe we can build something here. A new life." Ahuli looked over at her younger sister. There was something about Simi's optimism that always made her feel a little less burdened. But the reality of their situation still weighed on Ahuli's heart. She wasn't sure if they could stay, but for the first time in weeks the idea didn't seem entirely impossible. "We'll see," Ahuli replied softly, giving Simi a small smile. "We'll take it one step at a time." That night, after a simple dinner of bread and vegetables, Margaret invited the sisters to sit by the fire in her home. The warmth from the flames filled the room, creating a comfortable space to relax after a long day. The fire crackled and popped, its soft light dancing on the walls. It was a peaceful evening, a far cry from the chaos of the past few weeks. Margaret poured them each a cup of tea, and they sat in quiet conversation, sharing stories of their lives. The sisters told Margaret more about their tribe, about the customs and traditions they held dear, and about their journey so far. Margaret, in turn, shared stories of her own childhood and the hardships her family had faced when they had first moved to this land. Ahuli found herself listening intently, grateful for the simple comfort of this moment. It felt strange, like a dream almost. Could things really be this easy? Could they really find safety in a place like this? As the fire burned lower and the night grew darker, Margaret smiled at the sisters. "You know, I've been thinking," she said slowly. "The town is small and the people here are good-hearted, but they could use some help. We all could. You've shared so much with me today, and I can see how much knowledge you have. If you're willing, maybe you could teach us some of the things you know. About the land, about survival, about how to live in harmony with nature. I think we could all learn from each other." Ahuli blinked in surprise. She had never thought about offering their knowledge in exchange for help. Their people had always kept to themselves, only interacting with others when absolutely necessary. The idea of sharing their traditions and wisdom with strangers was new to her, but something about Margaret's offer felt genuine. Simi, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Maybe we could show them how to grow crops in the way we've always done, or teach them about the plants and herbs that can heal." Ahuli looked at her sister, then at Margaret. There was a sense of peace in the room now, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She realized that, for the first time in a long while, they weren't alone. They had found something they hadn't been looking for: connection. "You're right," Ahuli said softly. "Maybe this is what we needed. Maybe sharing our knowledge with the town will be the start of something good." Margaret's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "I think it will be. And in return, we'll help you with whatever you need. If there's anything we can do to make your journey easier, we'll do it." The sisters exchanged glances. The idea of helping the town in exchange for their own safety and support felt right. They had been so focused on surviving that they hadn't thought about how much they could offer, and yet here was an opportunity to create something lasting, a bond between them and the settlers. That night, as they lay down in the barn once again, Ahuli couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. The fire had warmed them physically, but the conversation had warmed their spirits. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were beginning to live again. The next few days passed quickly, filled with work and new experiences. The sisters spent their time teaching the townspeople about the land, sharing the wisdom passed down to them by their ancestors. They taught them how to identify plants that could heal wounds, ease pain, and even prevent illness. They showed the settlers how to plant crops in a way that worked with the land, not against it. In return, the townspeople taught them new ways to build shelter, fix tools, and navigate the challenges of life in a town. Ahuli and Simi found themselves growing closer to the people here, feeling the beginnings of something they hadn't experienced in a long time: community. The settlers, who had initially been wary of the sisters, now looked to them with respect, appreciating the knowledge they shared. There was a sense of mutual understanding, a quiet but powerful connection forming between the two groups. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Margaret invited the sisters to join a gathering around the fire. The people of the town had come together for a simple celebration, nothing grand, just an opportunity to enjoy one another's company. There was music, laughter, and stories being shared under the vast, starry sky. Ahuli stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching the people she had once feared and mistrusted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at home. The night air was cool, but her heart was warm. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to thrive. Simi, who had always been the more outgoing of the two, was laughing with a group of children, teaching them a game she had learned when she was young. Ahuli smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always been the protector, the one who carried the burden of their journey. But in this moment, she realized that it wasn't just her strength that had brought them this far. It was their shared strength, the connection they had with each other and with the people they had met along the way. The fire crackled softly in the background as Ahuli joined her sister and the townspeople around the fire. As she sat down, she looked around at the faces of those who had once been strangers, but now felt like friends. She realized that no matter where their journey took them next, they had found something special here, something that went beyond survival. They had found a place where they could belong, and as the night wore on with the stars shining brightly above, Ahuli felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time she didn't feel alone. And that, she realized, was more than enough for now. The days in the small town passed quickly, filled with work, learning, and growing. Ahuli and Simi, once weary travelers with little hope, had found something they hadn't expected, a new sense of purpose. They taught the settlers about the land, the plants, and the ways of their people. The town, in turn, shared its resources, skills, and stories. The two groups were beginning to understand one another, and a bond was slowly forming between them. As the days turned into weeks, Ahuli and Simi began to feel more at home. The once quiet barn where they had slept became a place of rest, not just for the body but for the soul. The fear and uncertainty that had filled their hearts when they first arrived began to fade. They still didn't know if this town would be their permanent home, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a place where they could finally pause and take a breath. But just when Ahuli and Simi thought they had settled into a new rhythm, something unexpected happened. It was a crisp morning, the sky bright and clear, when a group of strangers arrived in town. They came in from the east riding horses and carrying heavy packs. The horses snorted as they trotted into the town, their hooves thudding softly on the dirt road. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women dressed in clothes that looked out of place among the settlers. They were rough-looking, their faces weathered and hard, and their eyes scanned the town with a kind of cold interest. The townspeople gathered cautiously, whispering to one another as the strangers approached. Ahuli and Simi, who had been working in the small garden behind Margaret's house, noticed the group as well. Ahuli stood up and exchanged a look with her sister. Something about the newcomers felt different, dangerous perhaps. Margaret, who had been walking nearby, walked up to greet them. She smiled, though there was a hint of unease in her expression. "Welcome," Margaret said, her voice warm but measured. "Can I help you?" The man, who appeared to be in charge, tall and with a hard set to his jaw, looked at her with sharp eyes. He didn't smile. "We're just passing through," he said gruffly, "but we've heard stories of people living here. Thought we'd see for ourselves." Margaret nodded, though the tension in her posture was clear. "Well, you're welcome to stay for a while if you need food or rest. We don't have much, but what we have we share." The man didn't reply right away. Instead, he scanned the town, his gaze lingering on Ahuli and Simi, who were standing off to the side. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a look that made Ahuli's heart skip a beat. It was as though he had seen them before. But where? How? The man turned back to Margaret. "We'll take you up on your offer for the night, but we're not interested in staying too long." Margaret nodded again, though she seemed wary. "Of course. We'll make sure you're taken care of." As the strangers dismounted and made their way to the small inn at the edge of the town, Ahuli felt a strange unease settle over her. Something about them didn't feel right. She couldn't explain it, But the way they looked at her and Simi made her nervous. She knew they had to be careful. The world was full of people who could bring danger, even in the most unexpected places. That evening, after the strangers had settled into the inn, the town gathered for dinner as usual. The atmosphere was a little tense, and everyone could sense that something had changed. The newcomers' arrival had stirred up something in the air, and the comfort the town had felt just days before now seemed fragile. Margaret, as always, was the calmest presence in the room. She walked around offering food and drink to everyone, including the strangers. Ahuli and Simi, sitting together at the table, exchanged glances. They didn't know who these people were, but they could feel the tension between them and the town. The strangers weren't here just for food or rest. There was something more. After dinner, Margaret walked over to the sisters, her brow furrowed in concern. "They've been asking questions," Margaret said softly, her voice low. "About you two. About your people." Ahuli's heart skipped a beat. "What did they ask?" Margaret looked around, making sure no one was listening too closely. "They wanted to know where you came from, where you were headed. They seem to know more than they're letting on." "I think they might be tracking you." Simi looked up sharply. "Tracking us? But why?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. But I don't like the way they look at you. They're not here just to visit. I think they might have followed you from the east." Ahuli felt a cold chill run down her spine. The thought that these strangers might have been following them, watching them, made her stomach turn. Had they been tracked all this way? If so, who were these people? And why did they want to know about them? Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ahuli lay awake, listening to the sounds of the wind outside. She could hear the faint murmurs of conversation from the inn, but she couldn't make out the words. Her mind raced with questions. What if the strangers were not just passing through? What if they were part of a larger group? What if they had been sent to track down the last of her people? She glanced over at Simi, who was fast asleep, her face peaceful in the moonlight. Ahuli didn't want to wake her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. The next morning, the strangers were gone. They had packed up and left before sunrise, leaving no trace of their visit except for a few discarded supplies in the inn's yard. The town buzzed with confusion as people tried to piece together what had happened. "Where did they go?" one of the townspeople asked. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know, but they left in a hurry." Ahuli and Simi stood near the edge of the town, watching as the last of the strangers' horses disappeared over the hill. A sense of unease lingered in the air. Whatever their visit had meant, it wasn't over. They would have to be careful. The strangers might be gone for now, but Ahuli knew they would return. The question was why. As the day went on, the sisters spoke little, their minds occupied with the events of the night. They couldn't ignore the feeling that something dangerous was on the horizon. But for now, they had no choice but to remain in the town and wait. The town had become a place of unexpected safety, but now, it seemed that danger had found its way into their lives once again. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the journey was far from over, and this town, once a place of refuge, had just become a place where something much bigger was about to unfold. The days that followed the mysterious visit from the strangers were filled with a quiet tension. The town went back to its routine. People worked in the fields, tended to their gardens, and repaired tools, but there was a subtle unease in the air. Everyone had felt the presence of the strangers, and no one seemed to know what to make of it. Whispers filled the corners of the town, and even the children seemed more cautious, as if they could sense that something was not quite right. Ahuli and Simi had been unsettled by the strangers' visit, but they had also decided that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The truth was, they didn't know if they could trust the town forever, but they couldn't leave just yet. The life they had started to build here was fragile, but it was also the closest to safety they had felt in a long time. They had found kindness even if it had been unexpected, and they weren't ready to give that up. One morning, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Margaret found the sisters sitting together near the barn. They were talking in soft voices, their heads bent as they shared thoughts about the future. Margaret had noticed the way they had been growing closer to the people in the town, teaching them more about their customs and ways of living. She had seen the change in their faces, the small but unmistakable shift from uncertainty to hope. But even so, Margaret knew the sisters were still haunted by the shadows of the past. "Ahuli, Simi," Margaret said, walking over to where they sat. I can see how much you've both given to the people here. But I can also see how much it's weighing on you. What happened last week with those strangers has made things uncertain again. I don't want you to feel like you have to stay here if you don't want to. If it's too dangerous. Ahuli stopped her with a raised hand. She looked at Margaret with a quiet, firm gaze. I appreciate your concern, Margaret, and I won't forget the kindness you've shown us. But we're not ready to leave just yet. We need more time. Simi nodded in agreement, her eyes thoughtful. The people here have been good to us. We've taught them, but they've also taught us. This town isn't perfect, but it's as close to home as we've felt in a long time. Margaret smiled softly, her face creased with wisdom. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. And if things do get more difficult, we'll figure it out together. We're all in this now. As the days passed, the sisters spent their time teaching more of the settlers about their ways. They showed them how to hunt in the forest, how to fish in the nearby river, and how to create medicines from the plants that grew around them. The settlers, in turn, shared their own knowledge of farming and building, teaching the sisters how to plant crops that would last through the colder months and how to repair old tools they had never used before. It was an exchange of skills, a blending of two worlds that only months before seemed so far apart. The settlers also began to open their hearts in ways Ahuli and Simi hadn't expected. They invited the sisters to share stories of their people, of the history and traditions that had been passed down through the generations. In return, the sisters listened to the settlers' own tales of hardship and resilience. They found that despite their differences, they shared many of the same values: love for family, respect for the land, and a desire to make a life that was worth living. But even as they grew closer to the town, Ahuli couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking somewhere in the distance. The strangers who had visited and the unsettling way they had looked at the sisters stayed with her. It wasn't just fear for herself and Simi that troubled Ahuli. It was the fear of what might happen to the people in this town if the strangers came back. She couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, she sat by the fire with Simi and Margaret, watching the flames flicker and dance in the cool night air. Margaret, Ahuli said, her voice quiet but urgent, I don't think we can stay here forever. I fear those strangers may return, and I don't want to put the people of this town in danger. Margaret looked at her carefully, her expression understanding, but also calm. You've been through so much, Ahuli, but you can't carry all of this on your own. The people here are ready to stand with you. If those strangers come back, they won't be able to do anything without facing the town first. Ahuli looked into the fire, her mind swirling with thoughts of what could be. I don't know what to do. I don't want to leave, but I don't want to risk everyone's safety either. Simi spoke up then, her voice soft but full of hope. Maybe we don't have to leave. Maybe we can all be stronger if we stay together. Margaret smiled at Simi, her eyes twinkling with warmth. I believe that's true. But it's up to you two. I can't decide for you. I only want what's best for you. Ahuli thought about it for a long time that night. She thought about her people, the ones they had left behind, and about the strangers who were still out there somewhere. The weight of it all felt heavy on her shoulders, but as she looked at Margaret and Simi, she realized something important. They weren't alone anymore. In the morning, Ahuli and Simi made their decision. They would stay in the town, at least for now. They would continue teaching, continue learning, and continue building the community that had become so much more than just a place to hide. They would stay and face whatever came next. Together, the town rallied behind them. The settlers offered their full support, agreeing that if the strangers returned, they would stand united to protect their home. The bond that had formed between the sisters and the town was stronger than any fear. For the first time, Ahuli felt truly at peace with the idea of staying. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was theirs. Weeks passed and the town grew stronger. The settlers had learned new ways to live in harmony with the land, and the sisters had found a sense of purpose they hadn't felt in years. They weren't just surviving, they were living. They were creating something that would last, something that wasn't just about escaping danger, but about building a future. One bright morning, as Ahuli and Simi were working in the garden, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. It was Margaret walking toward them with a smile on her face. As she came closer, she spoke, her voice filled with excitement. They've gone, she said. The strangers are gone. They were just passing through and they've left the area completely. Ahuli exhaled, relief washing over her like a wave. It wasn't over, not entirely, but this was a victory. They had faced the unknown and they had stood strong. The town had proven that it was more than just a place of refuge, it was a community, a family. And in that moment, Ahuli realized that their journey had come full circle. They had found what they were looking for, not just safety but belonging. This town, with all its challenges and imperfections, had become home. A place where the past could be honored, the present could be embraced, and the future could be built, together. The sisters stood in the garden looking out over the fields, the sun casting its golden light on everything around them. They had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while they knew that whatever came, they would face it as a family.